All right. Good morning, good afternoon, hello, and welcome to the Sprint 42 review. Just ended a couple of days ago. Next slide. So as usual, I will go over the statistics. Greg B will go over the providers. Greg T over the platform. Alberto on the REST API. Greg M on Automate, and Rich on SmartState. Next slide, please. So this sprint, while it was 3 weeks long officially, was really 2 weeks long because of the ManageIQ summit in the middle of it. So it has, instead of around 300 pull requests, it has around 200 pull requests, kind of as expected. Roughly half are bugs, and everything else is sprinkled around there. But still a good chunk are bugs. Because we were trying to stabilize Darga, which was released, which I'll talk about in a separate slide. Next slide, please. All right. As for features, the breakdown, providers had 48, I think it is, and 72 in the UI. And inside the providers, we have 10 in the containers and 9 on Ocular. Cool. And what's the light blue thing? That's Azure. Oh, nice. Well, that matches.
But it's cyan.
All right. Next slide, please. This low sprint, it looks somewhat similar to 33. We'll keep monitoring this to see if we can read this chart and discern anything valuable from it. But we want to keep it moving to see if there is some information there that can be grokked. Next slide. All right. The other repos that were included, well, first of all, during this sprint, we moved 2 QE repos into the ManageIQ organization on GitHub. So that number 2 repo there, the integration test, that's the one that QE uses. And then down towards the bottom, it's Rapin API, I think it's called. So those are the 2 that were moved. But as you see, most of the work is on the integration test, which is cool. ManageIQ org is the website, the blogs, and everything else. And the other stuff, the Azure Armrest, the self-service, all of those were addressed as well. Next slide, please. All right, so ManageIQ Summit was a well-attended event. Over 160 people from all over the world. There were 26 sessions and 34 presenters. And I believe that now the slides and the demo clips are available. Look on ManageIQ.org, and there's a blog post about it. Thanks again to the sponsors, Ansible, Google, Nuage, and Red Hat for making it happen. During the week of ManageIQ Summit, we released Darga GA, so it's out there now, and Capablanca is no longer one of the available branches. Is no longer one of the available stable releases. But if in the download screen of ManageIQ.org website, but if you do need it, I think the copies are still there on releases.manageiq.org. The next release name was chosen as well. It was named after a Dutch chess champion, the fifth champion in the world, Max Euwe. So that's going to be the name of the next release, coming out towards November, December, somewhere in that time frame. All right. Well, and next slide, please. I think that's it. Yep. Turn it over to Greg B.
All right, hey everyone. So as Oleg pointed out, Sprint 42 was a little lighter than most sprints due to the summit a couple weeks ago, but there are still several highlights to point out from the provider side. I'm going to talk about some of the updates from the containers team, the OpenStack team, and the Ocular team, as well as some VMware updates and some core providers work that was merged this sprint. Next slide. On the containers front, we saw an important update to limit the number of concurrent SmartState analysis scans. Because of the potentially large number of containers and images involved in the container management world, without this limit, it was possible to kick off way too many concurrent scans and just overload the appliance. And so that fixes that, allows us to limit the number of those scans. Next slide. From the OpenStack integration team, there were a couple good highlights to point out. First, after scaling down, ManageIQ will now clean up the Nova services on the compute node that was removed from the cluster. And also, a new built-in policy was added to prevent retired instances from being started again. This was kind of because sometimes when OpenStack instances were retired, the instances in OpenStack were left in a state where it could actually be rebooted. And this policy just prevents that from happening from within OpenStack. Next slide. The Hawkular team fixed a number of bugs this sprint, including some fixes to live metrics support, adding some missing fields in the UI, including like host name in several places, and creating a default view layout for the middleware data sources page. Another big change from the Hawkular team is the new top-level navigation menu item for middleware. This brings middleware up to a primary component for ManageIQ and starts to broaden that full scope of management capability that ManageIQ will take on. So really exciting. Next slide. Adam had a patch this sprint that fixed how ManageIQ adds disks to VMs in VMware. And when Adam explained this to me, he's explained it to me several times, and it's taken me several times to understand it. But finally, the way I imagined it was the disk defrag window that some of us grew up with. Essentially, the original implementation would, for adding disks to VMs, would end up leaving gaps in the list of SCSI controllers, and this new implementation finds and fills those gaps. And this allows ManageIQ to use all the maximum number of controllers available without, leaving some gaps behind and then maxing out early. So next slide. Finally, for providers, Marcel has been staying busy on the pluggability front. Some of you might remember my talk about pluggable providers at the ManageIQ Summit, where I talked about the steps to getting to pluggability. One of the steps that's in progress is this ask but don't assume step. The two pluggability patches from Marcel this sprint address that step specifically. So first, Marcel tracked down some view helpers that were referencing specific provider classes and replaced them with appropriate questions. I think it was removing Amazon and asking whether the provider had an IP address, which is relevant because when we add Amazon, we don't actually add an IP address. We know which IP to go to talk to Amazon. So Amazon sits in a special category there. Secondly, in the cloud instances summary pages, we're no longer assuming that only OpenStack instances can show the CPU architecture. We're now asking whether the instance supports showing the architecture. That actually opens it up to allowing providers like Amazon, Google, Azure, anybody else that has this ability to show the CPU architecture, to show it on that page and not just restrict it to looking at a specific type and a specific type of provider. So these are just a couple of examples of the level of detail that's involved in tracking down these changes. And I'm sure there's many, many more to come, and Marcel's hot on that trail. But that's it from the providers front, and over to GT to talk about platform updates.
Okay, so the platform team, I'd say, spent most of its time squashing blocker bugs for the release. But we did get some improvements in performance and a couple other enhancements that I'll talk about, and then I'll save the rest for Alberto. Next slide, please. Joe Raffanello made a really good change to lazy load message catalogs. So we get a few seconds back on startup and a pretty big reduction in memory. That's a really nice one. Nice improvement there. Next slide. So on the appliance console side, Joe V did some work to limit the menu to remove the appliance console menu to remove the items from the menu that are not applicable to containers. Some of them are actually don't necessarily work properly if you execute them. That was a good enhancement. They got that in last minute. Next slide. That was me. What's a sprint demo without a replication slide? So on the replication front, small change, deprecating the old Ruby rep for Darga. So we actually added the deprecated message in the replication worker settings screen, and we're going to remove it altogether for the e-release. Yeah. Wait. I'll practice that for the next time.
E-release.
Next slide, please. And for testing, Chris and Joe Raffanello worked on implementing parallel tests so that you can, if you run it locally, you'll save a lot of time because it'll use all your cores. And on Travis, they're saying we cut out about 15 minutes, which is pretty awesome because it's taken quite a bit of time to run the tests. And I think that's all we got for the platform. Next slide. Alberto.
So on the API prompts, we've updated the documentation to reflect the version 2.2.0 changes for Darga, and that's been merged on ManageIQ docs. Next slide, please. And yeah, so the one minor issue we had was that the enhancements that were added to the API YAML were not always sorted, so this kind of changes. It guarantees that the collection list returned by the API is always sorted. Minor enhancements there. And I think that's it. Off to Gregg M.
Yeah, thanks, Alberto. So in this sprint for Automate within the engine, we added an enhancement to allow the method calls to use arguments within substitution here. So in the two examples we have there, the requester email is kind of the old format where you could reference an object like user and get one of the properties, in this case, email. The second example shows that it's going against a request object and using get options. In this case, still getting email, but obviously there's a lot of data stored within get options. So this work was done as part of the effort for consolidated email, which we're still working on, but I'm sure it'll be used in other places. And then the policy change here, I think, is what Greg B was referring to earlier. We have built-in policy that we already exists for, say, starting an infrastructure VM that's retired. Internally, we capture that and make sure that it can't start. For cloud, those VMs, if we stop them, a lot of times the instance goes away. So in cases where you want to do something like extend retirement, we can't stop that instance. So we pause them, and you don't want to resume them unless it's been marked as unretired. So we added that built-in policy to capture that and prevent those from being restarted. Next slide. Cool. Service model, small change, just exposing the provision priority, which in service provisioning, when you have a service bundle with sub-items, sub-services under it, they have a provisioning order. It's part of the join table between that parent bundle and the service item. So when you're at the child level, you don't know what join object is actually holding that value for the current relationship. So we know that within the model. Obviously, we're using that there to to sequence the processing of the services. So we just wanted to expose that. We know that people were implementing their own routines to get to that value. So that was an easy one to expose for us since we're already doing it internally. And then this last one, we had removed some logic around VM retirement, where we would only proceed through retirement if we had provisioned the VM or if it had a lifecycle tag applied to it. We wanted to initially clean up that logic, and we removed that, but the feedback was that it was important to keep that in place. So kind of two things. One, we reverted that change. So now the retirement still checks to see if there's an MIQ provision associated with the VM, or it has the lifecycle tag applied to the VM. In addition, we added the actual lifecycle category and tag that you need to tag it with. Previously, that was not in the product. So if you wanted to use the tagging, you had to actually go and create the category, which was a little odd. So we added that in as well. Next slide. And finally, just a few things on the Ansible side. For jobs, we're now collecting the parameters. I unfortunately didn't have one in my database to get a screenshot of, but if you're looking at the Ansible job, you can now see the parameters that were used to launch that job, and they're collected during the refresh. And if there is an error during an Ansible job deployment, we're now logging the output from Ansible into our log so that it's easier to determine what failed there. I think that is it. Over to Rich.
Okay, just a few things this sprint. We had 5 pull requests. 4 of them were bugs. 1 was refactoring, and this sprint we had some contributions from the Rev team where they had 2 pull requests merged. I believe one of them was a bug, and the other was that one refactoring pull request. And that's it.
Okay. Next slide. All right, and I think there was there's no slide on the UI team, but they basically fixed bugs this last sprint, so there's nothing really of on the enhancement side worthwhile to be discussed. All right, so with that, we conclude the sprint 42 review, and the next one is in 3 weeks as usual. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone and open it up to questions or comments. 68 people on the call. Somebody has to have a comment, a question, or something. 68 plus all the Mawa people, no people. So 100 people.
Oh, Frank.
Yeah, we need Frank.
All right. Thank you, Sergio. All right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you all in 3 weeks again.
All right.
Thanks.